I've lived in Newton County since I was 6 weeks old, and I'll be 63 years old on December 11th of this year. I grew up here, as far as I can remember, back in the early 60s. So that was the transition of segregated accommodations for blacks and whites. And so when I was a little girl, the signs had just come down for, white only and colored only, but they were still separate accommodations. So even in this building, the public bathroom was in the back of this building, like down in a kind of like a awful little place, and it smelled bad. So I never used the bathroom when I came away from home because it wasn't clean. And another earliest memory is going to the dentist when I was about 4 years old, and I could read at that time, and the dentist office was right across the street, right above where the bread and butter restaurant is now. So when I read waiting room, I said to my grandmother, well, here's where we go. And she said, nope, that's not our waiting room. So over the years, I've seen the movement in the late 60s, early 70s, schools desegregated. And I don't use the word integration because I do not believe that even in 2021 we have full integration in Newton County. I think racism still exists, just the fact that we still have to have the discussion. Racism still exists, and there's still prejudice in many arenas. When we were in the 6th grade, I went to Washington Street Elementary School, which is now on the site of the Washington Street Community Center. What's left of the school was where the library, the principal's office, and the cafeteria, that's that end of the building. The rest of the building that new residents of Newton County don't know was our main school building. And when I was in the 6th grade, I guess federal law mandated that schools had to be desegregated the following year. And so imagine waking up and your school is on fire in the middle of the night. And so brave citizens, tried to salvage the next day what was left in the school building. And you would think that with 2.5 months or so left in the school year, what would you do? They would move students to another school. They didn't move us to another school. When the sun was shining, we had to sit outside, and we were taught outside in chart desks, and the teachers did the best they could. And then when it rained, they herded us into the cafeteria, and they huddled us into corners. And the cafeteria that you know now as the community center was the same cafeteria we had with the kitchen. So imagine them having to serve breakfast and lunch. And so the following year, 7th grade, because the white people who were resistant to change said that they didn't want their children going to school with the N-word, Negroes, black people. And so the following fall, when it was time to go to school, the buses were supposed to pick us up, and we lived right off of Washington Street by Grace United Methodist Church. So we waited and waited and waited, and the bus didn't come until about 9:30. So I grew up with my grandmother, so she walked over to the Board of Education office, which is at the corner of Anderson Avenue and Newton Drive. And so she asked Mr. Richardson, who was our superintendent, why wasn't there a bus for the children in our community? And he said, well, Maggie, we don't have enough buses. So what she did, she took it upon herself, and she asked one of our former neighbors, who was a bus driver for white children in Porterdale. He picked us up. My brother and I walked to the top of the hill. So we got to school about 45 minutes early because he had to go do his route to pick up other children. And then afterwards, we sat, and I thought about it years later, we had to sit in the back of the bus while he took the white kids home, and then we got home about 45 minutes late. And so the teachers that I had, one of them said many, many years later, because I was a pretty decent student, all A's and everything, and she said that I was so smart that even the white children had to ask me questions to help them with their homework. And so, kids call your name. When we were in the band, they threw rocks at your bus. When we went certain places, teachers didn't want to answer your questions. So yeah, I've experienced some prejudice. And then when I went to Y Camp up in Toccoa, and then when I went to 4-H camp down at Rock Eagle, my grandmother always warned me that when I took a shower to take my clothes in with me, because the girls would play tricks on you and everything, and then you'd be without clothes and you couldn't go anywhere. So I've seen a lot more than that, but those were a few examples of my early education in Newton County. So I'm from here. I mean, the only reason that I got here when I was 6 weeks old is because my mother had me in Louisiana. But our family's from here. My mother just passed away last year, August of 2020, but the house is on the two houses are on the same piece of property that we've been able to own since black people could own land here in Newton County after the Civil War. So we have history here. My great-great-great-grandfather was Tony Baker. He was born somewhere around 1837. He was the first pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church. And Bethlehem Baptist Church, 1849, was the Colored Baptist Church. Then in 1850 became Bethlehem. And he pastored the church for 46 years, then was followed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was Michael King when my mother and them knew him, but his maternal grandfather was the pastor at Bethlehem. So then our family's always been here. My mother and aunt, grew up here, going to school here, graduating in the Washington Street High School class of 1947. And they were told when they went to Morris Brown, they graduated, and my grandparents were counseled in 1951 for them not to challenge the state school system of segregation because it wasn't time for colored children to go to white universities. So my mother and my aunt were then given paid educations. My mother first she went to check out Michigan State University for her master's. She didn't put down her race. She gets up there and they said to her they didn't have housing for colored women. And then she came back down to Evanston, Illinois, and the then president of the Board of Regents, a wonderful man named Mr. Bob Arnold, who the Arnold Fund locally is named for. Mr. Bob and Miss Florence didn't have children, but their maid was my grandmother's best friend. So they went over to meet with him, and he said, well, Imogene, we'll send you wherever you want to go. She went to Northwestern, got her master's in 1955. They had already taught here in Newton County. They taught at a county school. If you know where James Paschal Baptist Church is, immediately to the left or to the north of James Paschal, go down 278 to 142. There are now 2 apartments right next to the church. That was a 2-room schoolhouse. So my mother taught there for her first year, and my aunt taught in Newbern, somewhere off of 213, but I don't think that building is still standing. My aunt did not teach the full year, and jokingly, my mother was always sore about that because my aunt discovered that they were teaching children who were sharecropping children, and they had to pad the books to say they were at school every day to get the free fruit that the federal government would give based on the number of students in school. So my aunt went over to the superintendent, who was Mr. Fickwood, who the theme school is named after, and she said, I cannot lie, she turned in her attendance book and she quit. And so my mother always was upset because she said my aunt, whose name was Ernestine, she got paid for the rest of the year and my mother had to work. So my aunt finished the year being a nanny for a rich white family up in Connecticut, meandered back down to Philadelphia, went to the Temple School of Social Work, so that's where she did her graduate work, and she retired with about 35 years as a social worker, writing some of the foster care plans. She was the one for the city of Philadelphia, and she wrote the maternity policy because when she had my youngest cousin as a social worker and came back, they wanted her to start at ground zero. She petitioned, and so they rewrote the rules. My mother did wonderful things as she taught down in South Georgia, in Irwinton, Georgia. She was teaching. She was one of the first special education teachers in the state of Georgia when the federal law was passed in the early 60s. And then my mother tells us, I mean, she told us of stories where once children came to her and they said, "Miss Williams, you know, tar is dripping on us in the bathroom." And so she went in there, and they had done a half job of re-roofing the school. She knew then Governor Lester Maddox. She wrote him a letter, and on a teacher's work day, he sent word to her that he would come down and check it out. And she said, you know, I can't tell him that I called the governor. So he comes down, he's like, "Imogene, where's the bathroom?" She's like, you know, nods her head. They go down there, the bathroom got fixed over the weekend. And she also realized that black teachers and white teachers got paid different salaries for the same job, even here in Newton County. She complained that they were taking 25 cents out of her check. And when she went over to see the superintendent, he said that the check had to be printed and the secretary had to mail it. And she said because it's a public school system with federal funds, those monies are already allocated, and she asked for a refund of all of her money that had been, you know, that had been taken out of her check. So we have, our family's been here forever, so I feel a calling, you know, to stay here and do what I can to try to help neighbors, friends, and family. So education was so important in our family. My mother and my aunt's mother, my grandmother, who actually brought my brother and I up, when she was born, April 20th, 1908, her mother and her twin sister died. So her dad, the story goes that her dad brought her in a basket to her grandmother, who was born in slavery, somewhere around 1861, actually was alive here in Covington when General Sherman marched through. Her grandmother didn't understand the importance of education. My grandmother grew up with her grandmother on the same corner where our property is, as I said earlier. And when my grandmother was about 13-ish, 14, some people came to the house and they said, "We would like to pay for Maggie to go to finish high school and then go on to Spelman," because she was a smart student. And back then they called it normal school to finish high school. So her grandmother, who did not know any better, and it was no fault of her own, no formal education, she thought about it. She said my grandmother was old and she needed to go to work and, you know, start having a family. So my grandmother made a promise that if she ever had children, you know, they would go not just finish high school, but go on to college. So education was expected. Academic excellence was expected. You just had no choice in my grandmother's household. So when it came time to apply, well, to think about college, because I always knew I was going, I thought that I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon because my grandfather, who taught me how to read from his wheelchair, I thought I'd be an orthopedic surgeon and, you know, be some cure to help people with multiple strokes learn to walk and do some things. But that didn't pan out. We got a doctorate in another area. But so when I start thinking about college, all through, you know, school, through junior high school, because we didn't have middle school here, we had junior high school. Junior high school was on where the old R.L. Cousins is. That was our 8th and 9th grade year. And then where Sharp Learning Center is now, that's where we spent 10th grade, because the high school was supposed to be finished. It wasn't, so we went to the new high school that's been torn down. Shows you how old I am. But we went there in the fall of 1974, so Horace's class was the first one to graduate, and we were the second. So in the 10th grade, my SAT scores were so high that those scores would get me into Harvard, right? So my little contest for 11th and 12th grade was to just try to better my SAT scores that I had in the 10th grade. Because back then, you know, my grandmother said, go do your best, so it wasn't a PSAT, regular SAT. My 10th grade scores were good enough to get me into Harvard, Howard, Yale, Emory, you know, so I thought, and also at that time, black colleges, now called HBCUs, were in financial crises. So the Morris Browns of the world, the Clarks, probably not Spelman and Morehouse, not Tennessee State, but most of them were in a financial crisis as I was about to graduate high school in 1976. So my grandmother made the choice for me. I tell people I didn't make a choice to go to Oxford College. She told me that Mr. Bob Arnold, same Mr. Bob, sent the money for my deposit for my dorm and for my application, and my grandmother said, you got a full scholarship to go to Oxford, so that's where you're going. And if you knew my grandmother, what did I say? Yes, ma'am. And so that's where, so I go to Oxford, fall of 1976, on a full academic scholarship, full scholarship. But since we're talking about how we've seen the community grow and everything, and there was embedded even discrimination and prejudice, even in the scholarships, because we were given ID numbers. I'm Z0762, still remember it like a brand, from 1946. That was my ID number. But the black students were given monetary scholarships. The white students were given percentage scholarships. So let's say it costs $10,000 your first year. So I got 10 grand. Keep your grade point average up. You know, I got to 10,000, but guess what happens the second year? Tuition and fees go up. The white kids, because they have 100% scholarship, if it went up to 11, they got $11,000. Avis got introduced to NDSL, National Direct Student Loans. They said, Avis, you only got $10,000 a year. So we have signed right here, and imagine 1976 when the minimum wage was $1.76. Well, I was making $1.76 an hour. And then I got a raise to $1.85. I think in 4 years, I was making $2.12 an hour in 1980. So I graduated Oxford in 1978 with an associate's degree. I didn't finish college on time. I mean, I'm proud to tell that story. I had too much fun in my undergraduate years. I didn't finish on time, so my senior GPA dropped. So out of embarrassment, you know, I left school for a while. I went back later, you know, got my bachelor's degree in chemistry, worked as a chemist, owned my own business. Oxford and Emory were very lonely places for black students academically. Our only friends at Oxford were the custodians and the people that sat at the desk in the dormitory and the people that worked in the cafeteria. So in Horace's class, the late Judge Horace Johnson, there were 8, because I was counting them. And imagine after 45 years, I can still name all 8 of his class. They were sophomores when I was a freshman, and where they were from. And I can name all 7 of the ones in my class and where they were from, because we had to become a family. We had no black faculty. So the first wave of students, the late John Hammonds Jr., who's Raymond's older brother, had a perfect SAT score, graduated Oxford in 1970, but had such a hard time, he transferred over to Georgia State and got his accounting degree. Others had a hard time, being called words and, finding things hanging in your room. And when I got up to Emory, start of my senior year, my roommate hated black people. Well, 2 nights a week I worked 6 to midnight, because I got NDSLs. I had about $8,000 in loans by then, right? In the fall of 1979. So I get off at midnight, come back in my room, and the girl screaming, I'm in the bed at 9 o'clock. And really, she hated black people. So when my brother would come visit, by then he was a sophomore at Morehouse, she screamed. So she left after 3 weeks, and I got a very good roommate who was from Bainbridge, Georgia. So when we were never able to tell her grandparents that her roommate was black, me, because they were very prejudiced. And when her mother called one day, she said, never forget it, she said, don't they have schools for y'all? Why are you at Emory? And I had to remember my grandmother's very tactful way of teaching us how to answer questions. I said, I want to go to medical school, Miss Powell, and Emory's one of the best, and so that's why I'm here, and I earned the right, to be able to go. And she said, I guess that's a good reason. But they never came to visit their daughter during the whole year because she occupied space with a black person. So we had maids at Emory, because a lot of the kids are rich from the Northeast and everything. So imagine being from Covington, somebody knocks on your door, and it's somebody you know because they're a friend of your grandmother's. And she said, I'm here to clean your room. And I said, Miss, and I called her name. I said, but you can't clean my room because Miss B, that's what we call my grandmother. I said, she'll kill me because I'm not over here. And she said, I need my job, Avis. So she had, once a week, she had to come in, sweep my room, mop my room, clean my counter, straighten up things on the counter. Every day she had to empty my trash. And then if I had paid for the extra service, she would strip my bed and change my bed. Because that's what the white girls had been used to, because they had maids and nannies at their own homes. And what really disturbed me was that, you know, I'll be 63, so you grew up with respect calling them Miss or Mister. They called them by their first name, and they were old enough to be the kids' grandparents. So we saw that, and then another story in the library, I've told this a couple of times, that when I went over and got introduced to the library, the lady who worked in the library was the custodian. When it was time for a break, I went and I said, would you like to come have a 15-minute break with me? And she said, Avis, I can't go in the break room. She said, I can only clean it. And so I said, but, it's the break room. She said, let me show you. She took me to a mop closet under the stairs in the back of the library, and there was a 5-gallon bucket. She said, that's what I sit on. It was dark and dingy, and the sinks with that the mop goes into. So that's where she had to wring her mop and do, but that's also where she had to eat her lunch and her sandwich. So she said, don't say anything, because I'll lose my job. I was 17 years old, so we had a new dean. I go to the head librarian, and I said, because I asked my grandmother about it, I said, well, how do I fix this? And she told me some strategic ways to approach it. So I go to the head librarian, and I said, I think she has, and back then they called them senile, so I said, I think she has senility. And so the librarian says, huh? I said, she still thinks it's 1876 that black people and white people can't eat together. And she sits back, and then she says, what do you mean? I said, she told me that she's not welcome in the break room. And then I added, I wonder what our new dean would think if the custodian thinks that she's not welcome to eat in the break room with the white people. But I don't want her to know that I said anything because she's afraid you'll fire her if I say something. So needless to say, when I went to work the next week, she said, Avis, did you do anything? And I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And she was eating in the break room. But I mean, little things, you got to speak up because you got to figure out a way to do it. Because if I confronted it in a strange way, she'd have lost her job. And her husband was a custodian at one of the churches. So we couldn't have that. So I just had to do what I needed to do. Gotta know Jesus. Sometimes it's very tough if someone calls you out of your name, or you're being discriminated against, or you don't get all the homework assignment, or you're expected to do above and beyond. You have to jump higher, run faster just because of the color of your skin. In the 10th grade, I was the best flute player in the band, but I couldn't be the first chair flute player because the 3 white girls had parents who were very notable figures in our community. So, and then the band director talked to my grandmother, and he said, well, but I'll make her first chair, second section, so she'll sit on the end and everybody can see her. But that made me the 4th flute player, and I was the number 1 flute player. And he said, well, but one of them's going to be, assistant drum major, one's a flag, and the other 2 were flag girls, so technically in football season, she'll occupy the first seat, but it wasn't given to me, honestly, right, because of the color of my skin. So, getting to know Jesus, growing up in a great church, learning love. Hate was never preached at our house. My grandmother just said, put something between your ears and let education speak for you. And then learn temperance and patience. But also don't be afraid to speak up, but know strategically when you surveyed the whole situation, how to speak up. Because in this, talking to young people, it's something when you're looking at a gun and a white person is talking to you, right? So, we tell them how to respond when the police stop you. So I've been stopped twice. So I was in this small town, coming back to Covington, coming back home, and I don't go through this particular town at night because I have better sense, right? Middle of the day, I left Macon, coming home, and I see the police pulls me over, and I have an Emory plate on my car, just because I'm proud of my alma mater for those 4 degrees, right? And I think I was on my 3rd one then. So the guy comes up to me, I knew I was in trouble when he said, "Hey, Missy." He said, "Where are you going?" So he stood where I could see his gun, and I'm trying not to wet my pants because you're like, nobody knows I'm here, and I keep my wallet like right under the seat. So I asked him, I said, "Would you mind if I get my," he said, "I need to see your driver's license." I said, "Sir," because I know how to be Southern then, right? Because he's showing his gun, like literally he pulls this back, so I'm looking right at his gun, and he says, "Where's your driver's license and your insurance, Missy?" Well, we were using computers by then, so he knew he'd already run my plate. But I said, "Sir, my license is right under my seat. I just need to reach." Told him what the wallet looks like. It's the first thing in there. I hand it to him, and that's why, on a sidebar way, that's why I appreciate satellite radio, and I pay for it now, because Gospel Station was on, and he says to me, he said, "You sound like you mighty happy, Missy. Do you work up there at that Emory University?" And I said, "No, sir, finishing my master's." "Well, why are you so happy?" And he kept saying, "Missy." Never told me why he stopped me, nothing like that. Then he said, "Well, you sound like you're some kind of preacher." Open segue, Jesus, right? I said, "Yes, sir, I am." I said, "I just came from Macon from the medical center where my friend who had a brain tumor, we just found out that she's gonna live." And I said, "Yes, sir, I am happy. And I thank God for that." So he goes back, he comes back, he hands me my license, and he says, "Have a nice day." My second instance, right here in Covington, is I went over, my mother was visiting a friend of hers on Deering Street. So I go down Conyers Street, go to pick her up. She needed to go to the bank. And I was driving a little BMW with a Emory plate. And so the guy, here I am turning left in front of him. He's at a stop sign. I'm at a stop sign. I'm turning left. So who has the right of way? He does. He motions for me to turn left. So I said, getting ready to get stopped. So I turn left in front of him. Lights come on again, comes up, same thing, Georgia State Patrol. So I'm still wondering why he stops me. I'm in a white neighborhood. That's why he stopped me, right? So he said, "May I see your license, registration? Do you work at Emory?" This is like 5 years apart. But because it's Emory, mostly white, "Do you work there?" "No, sir. That's where I went to school." So then he says, "Oh, I couldn't see your tag and your expiration because you had an AKA frame on top of it." But now imagine me being in front of him, so he couldn't see the rear in the beginning anyway. He made up something. So then he goes to the book, and he stated chapter and verse, and he said, "If I can't see your whole tag and and when it expires, your little decal, technically you're breaking the law." And I wanted to say, so you can't ever have a frame on your car because it'll hide a little bit because each month has a different color. But I didn't say that because my mother was in the car and she's afraid. So he hands me my license back, and then I go on my way. So imagine being a young person who doesn't know and has done nothing, and you get stopped just because of the color of your skin and maybe the car that you're in. And so my third example is I was able to go with Chief Cotton, our police chief, 2 years ago to a meaningful conference in LaGrange, Georgia, where police departments all across the country are trying to do some work. And so the person who was the assistant to Eric Holder during President Obama's administration, she was home visiting family. She was from Cobb County and a very good friend of my best friend who's an attorney. She said they'd come from either a funeral or visiting a relative. She's getting ready to head back to the house. She sees her nephew pulled over, and she's like, "Well, I wasn't going to stop because I got my federal badge. I'm the Deputy U.S. Attorney General, so everything will be all right because he's done nothing. We just left where we were." Hour later, her nephew comes in crying. They strip searched him because they said, "How'd you get a car like this?" And he said, I didn't do anything wrong. So we have to, number one, make sure that as we talk to our young people, our law enforcement officials, our elected officials, number one, they have to believe that it's real, that we still have people who are behind a badge, who stop people because of the color of their skin. And we know we're not just talking George Floyd. There have been things here and throughout history. You know, we went with Oxford College students this past Saturday to Montgomery, to the lynching memorial. That's the second time I've been this year. And to see stories and to hear stories, and some happen right here in Covington, Newton County, and to see a box that has the name of a man from Newton County from 1889 who they recorded as being lynched. And then in 1946, 2 couples were shot to death because, you know, the Malcolms and the Dorseys. So we have a history of atrocities being committed against us because of the color of our skin. And so you got a right to be mad. But then you look at Jesus, he should have been, but then he lets the law of love rule, and he says, well, I still want them to, you know, stop being knuckleheads and racists, and I want them to be saved. And that's hard to understand until you just try to keep on practicing what Jesus taught and what he teaches. And that's what inspires me. But yes, I get despondent sometimes when I see the mistreatment. You know, some of our students even in Putnam County, you know, they tell me this week that they can't take AP classes because they're recommended to go to technical school and they want to be a surgeon. They don't have medical schools, you know, being a technician. And they're told, well, you should just take this because you don't want to be in debt. You can get scholarships because of your averages. So our children are being discouraged. They're all excited about high school, and they get to some places and they're being discouraged. So we have to continue encouraging them, find good partners in the community, and then just keep on building and teaching others that it's real, prejudice is real, and so is racism. And so that's why I get up every day. If you had told me years ago that I would answer the call, I would say, you know, nope, not me. So I took all these classes, even when I was in college, philosophy and religion. Didn't realize the calling was always there. It's just when you choose to answer. So I didn't answer my calling to active ministry until 2002. By then I had a certificate in theology, and our AKA Soros, Dr. Melba Costin, asked me, why are you doing a certificate program and you need to be doing a Master of Divinity? And I said, no, that's for preachers. And so I was headed to Florida to a football game to see my cousin Dante Culpepper play in Tampa, and I go down to Reverend Benton's sister's house, walk in the door, and she's, first thing, even before she said, hello, Avis, when you gonna answer your calling? I said, I don't have one, right? So I came back home, talked to Reverend Benton, who was our then pastor, in November, well actually the end of October of 2002, and he was busy writing. It was Bible class, and I said, Reverend, we need to have the meeting. So he didn't hear, he kept on writing, and I said, Reverend, we need to have the meeting. He said, oh, the meeting. So we scheduled a time to sit. He asked me what we needed to talk about, and I told him I felt that God had called me into active ministry. Then it felt like bricks fell off my shoulder. So in the Baptist faith, you know, you don't have to go to seminary or anything. So I preached my first public sermon February 8th, 2003, on a Saturday, so family could come and visit, and then they could travel back home on Sunday. And again, I wanted to learn and do more, so I applied and got into Candler School of Theology at Emory. Started there the fall semester of 2005, got my master's. And then I left and was still working and doing things. Started a church in that time. A church, we used to meet on Sunday evenings, and we used New Hope as our, because Pastor Miller just gave me the keys, and you know, anybody who wanted to just came by, and we were trying to help get people out of prison, and had a young man who was still working on his case to try to get him out of prison. He's been there for 14 years now. And so that's the kind of ministry, just outreach kind of things. And some of the resistance with some of the old guard who say, who haven't been educated, who don't read the word, say, God ain't called a woman, but yet if you say God can't call somebody, then you just limited God's power. And then in the same breath, they preach that God is all powerful. And then they argue, and then, and I don't want to discuss minute details of, you really should read the text and go back, and King James is only since 1611. Was there a Bible before then? Yes, certainly. You should read it sometimes, right? So you go to churches where they tell you, we don't acknowledge or accept or receive women ministers. I don't go there very often. And I know where they are, right? One time I went to one where, the usher says, Reverend, I'm sorry, but the pastor doesn't believe in women ministers. And it was somebody's funeral, and Reverend Benton was actually doing the eulogy. So myself and Pastor Nash, who also was a pastor at Flat Rock Baptist, she's retired now, Pastor Annette Nash, we were going to sit out, because that's not my church. I wasn't going to fight them. Reverend Benton announced to the pastor, he said, these are on the program, the order of worship, the family has written this, and if they're not a part of it, I'm not either. This is the family's request. Yes, sir, Reverend Benton. And so we sat in the pulpit. But I tell them all, y'all got to take it up with Jesus. I have to answer my calling, and so my day is full of answering what I've been called to do, so I'm not going to argue with people who weren't there, who didn't hear it. And he called me. He didn't call them. And I don't really get into those kind of serious discussions with them because I got too much work to do. Service, just trying to do what I can to help folks. And whoever calls, whether it's probably one of the most humbling things that I can talk about. Is a gentleman who has passed away. Reverend Bennett said he needed to meet me, and he was actually from Boston. And at that time, he was almost 70 years old, and I met him, and I was like, hey, I called his name. I said, what can I do to help you? And he said, I want you to teach me how to read. He said, I would like to be able to read the Bible. He said, my wife doesn't. He said, I had a supervisor's job. He said, but I was just quick to learn to see what I needed to do. And he said, plus, I want to tell my sons that I know how to read. And so I then, I pulled out some primary and elementary stuff, and then we started writing in pencil. And then that day when he was able to write his son a postcard, and he said, I'm writing this, and I finally learned how to read. So I just try to do what I can, when I can. That motivates me, especially to help children realize that their dreams can be achieved with hard work, with discipline, and respect your elders, and love everybody. So if I have done some of that as I have been sprinkled across this community, then the living, the work, I figure I got lots more stuff to do. And I'm happy, joyous, excited, humbled about what's in front of me and what else God has for me next. So my favorite Bible verse is John 15:13. Greater love hath no man, no person than this, that a man will lay down his life for his friends. So when you see everybody as a child of God, a brother or sister, our Newton County has so much opportunity. We have, great leadership. We have doors that have been opened, and it's a great place to be from, because that's where I came from, right? But it's a great place to be from, but it's also a great place to work, and to work in the vineyard. And, harvest time is coming. Laborers are few. There's a lot more work to be done. We got to clean up neighborhoods. We've got to help young people realize that nothing wrong with hard work. You don't work, you don't eat. And I work in an area at Lake Oconee where we have such a generous population of rich white people at Lake Oconee, a lot of them, first generation millionaires who don't mind helping anybody do anything, from a food drive to doing homes. I got to speak to the Men of Lake Oconee group this past Tuesday, where they have 185 men that have done $200,000 worth of work in some of the poorest sections that you will see in this entire country. There's still people with no running water. There's still people who, when I see their homes, it brings tears to my eyes. And until we can start doing something to encourage a great metamorphosis and transformation across the whole landscape of the community, where those who don't have will have more and have more opportunity, then we still have a lot of work to do. So let's keep working.